Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafetz, and welcome to Law on Film, a podcast that explores the rich connections between law and film. Law is critical to many films. Film, in turn, tells us a lot about the law. In each episode, we'll look at a film that's noteworthy from a legal perspective. What issues does the film explore? What does it get right about the law, and what does it get wrong? How does law help us understand the film, and what does the film teach us about the law and the larger social and cultural context in which it operates? This episode examines I Just Didn't Do It, a 2007 Japanese film written and directed by Masayuki Suo. In the film, 26-year-old Teppei Kaneko, played by Ryo Kase, is traveling to a job interview on a packed Tokyo commuter train when a 15-year-old schoolgirl, who was standing in front of him on the train and whom Kaneko hardly noticed, wrongly accuses him of groping, or chikan. Kaneko is subsequently arrested, at which point he is advised to just plead guilty and pay a small fine, after which he can go free. But because Kaneko maintains his innocence, he decides to fight the case, even though he's told that nearly everyone who takes their case to trial in Japan is convicted. The film then documents Kaneko's nightmare odyssey through the Japanese criminal justice system, where he's detained for months and ultimately convicted. I Just Didn't Do It provides important insights into the Japanese criminal justice system and a critique of how it operates. Joining me to discuss the film is Professor Naoko Akimoto. Naoko Akimoto is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Law and Politics at Ryo University in Tokyo in Japan. She's currently a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School. Before joining the faculty of Ryo University, Professor Akimoto was previously assistant professor at National Yangming Chiao Tung University School of Law in Taiwan and a visiting scholar at Washington University in St. Louis. Professor Akimoto earned her PhD from the University of Tokyo Graduate School for Law and Politics in Japan, where she concentrated on Anglo-American law. One area Professor Akimoto's teaching and research is on juries, and when I was previously a visiting scholar at Ryo University, I had the honor of co-teaching a seminar with Professor Akimoto on the jury system in America. Naoko, Professor Akimoto, it's wonderful to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me to your, the wonderful podcast. I'm very excited to talk with you on the film.
Well, can you just tell us a little bit of background on the Japanese criminal justice system, its origins, main features, things like that?
Sure. The modern criminal justice system in Japan was, established after the Meiji Revolution, as you may know, in the late 19th century after the samurai period, right? And then, at that time, the Japan transplanted European laws into Japan, like civil law or criminal law and the commercial law. And a code of criminal procedure was promulgated based on the German code at that time. And then the current Code of Criminal Procedure was enacted after World War II in accordance with the principle of our new constitution, which was influenced or, written by American, the government. And then, so the current Code of Criminal Procedure embraced the protection of fundamental human rights, which was, in the current constitutions. And under the current code, although the traditional European judicial systems, criminal judicial system is maintained, from the earlier one, the American law of criminal procedure influences a lot, at the same time. It's kind of mixture. And also, Japanese scholars of criminal procedure introduced doctrines and principles not only from Germany, but also from American law, such as evidentiary law. And then, we had a judicial system reform since the end of the 20th century to make the judicial system more close to the citizens and public. And as a part of that reform, the criminal procedure have also been amended to embrace and, speed up the process of the procedure and to expand the public defense system. And in addition, the lay judge system, which is called saiban system, has been in place since 2009, where the general public, the citizens, participates in the trial and the judgment of criminal cases. This is a very, very brief overview of Japanese criminal justice system.
And they participate as jurors, right?
Yeah, but it's different from, jury in America because the lay judge are selected, by those adults, but they participate with judges, together with judges. So it's not really an independent body like jury in the US.
The movie focuses on this particular crime, groping or chikan in Japanese. What's the legal and social significance of this offense?
Oh yeah, to understand the crime of chikan, the groping, and also its accusation, I think we need to look back some history in Japan because of course chikan is obviously the sexual crime. However, it is said that social awareness that groping is a crime did not exist until the early 1990s. Now, before that time, even though it was understood as immoral, but the groping was treated more like culture, and not a few magazines treated chikan as something like entertainment, right? And also posters at the train station described groping as a bad manner rather than, offense, a crime. And then also at that time, women were forced to self-defend rather than accuse, the criminal, the offender. So it's really the social culture, yeah, we have chikan, this is a problem. However, it's not really crime. And then men's, treated it as their culture and entertainment. But such a situation changed through especially the 1990s when some, women's movement against sexual offenses made a report on groping. And also, police officers started to actively crack down on the offense. And the increase in the number of women who work outside also, contributed to this change. So that's why, under this context, more and more, groping cases started to be accused in the criminal courts. And then, as the policing of groping became strict, the number of accusations increased as a result. I don't say number of the groping increased, the number of the accusation increased. Even though the actual number of groping is much more than the number of the accusation, however, still the number of the accusation increased at a time through 1990s. And then in general, however, the groping is offense that is difficult to accuse in the sense that it often lacks objective evidence. And then since the early 2000, in several cases of groping, the verdicts of not guilty were turned down, in the trial court. And then as the movie illustrates, having the not guilty verdict is very rare in Japan. So therefore, those cases were highlighted as miscarriage of criminal justice in Japan. And then this movie was taken in this social context in 2006.
It's very interesting how it evolves, and you almost get a sense in the movie that they're now the system is deciding to take this offense seriously and responding to kind of the way it had been taken less seriously by the legal system, as you explained in the past, which overall is a positive thing. On the other hand, it can present some problems in the case for the defendant.
Yeah, so there is some tension. Even the two problems are kind of, independent to each other, like sexual crimes as well as the miscarriage of criminal justice. However, it's we have some tension between the two.
And if you confess, if you admit it, the punishment is very light. And the movie shows us right in the beginning this one case where the person does commit the offense, clearly is arrested, confesses, and goes home. So after the defendant, 26-year-old Teppei Kaneko, played by Ryo Kase, is arrested and detained, he meets with the public defender who advises him to plead guilty. Kaneko will just have to pay a small fine. He'll be out in a day. It would be, the public defender says, like a traffic infraction. And then actually the film opens with a different case. There's a short segment before we get to Kaneko's case where a man, middle-aged man, clearly gropes a woman on the train. The man's taken to the station. He's presented with the accusations. He confesses, and he's released with, effectively kind of a slap on the wrist. Now, the public defender tells Kaneko that there's a 99.9% conviction rate in Japanese criminal courts. He tells him that interrogations can last for up to 3 weeks. Pretrial detention can last for 3 to 6 months, and it could be up to a year before any trial. So what role does the defender play in these situations, and how accurate is the characterization of the system and the pressure on defendants to plead guilty?
So I just, let me introduce like about some, procedure, like after the suspect is arrested, that under the Japanese criminal procedure, after the police officer or, the private citizen arrest the suspect, they should refer the suspect to the prosecutor's office within 48 hours. And then the prosecutor should request detention to the court within 24 hours. And then, the first public defender that you mentioned is one called Toban Bengoshi, who is sent from the Bar Association. And it's not really a public defender afforded under the criminal procedure. The Code of Criminal Procedure mandates to offer a public defender to detain the suspect and accused. However, it does not, offer a public defender to a not yet detained suspect, that within like 72 hours, right? And it is important to have a defense lawyer at this point before the decision is made to detain him, because the police office starts the interrogation and they start to make the record of the statement. So, that's why the other, suspect suggested him to call Toban Bengoshi at that point. And then, like as is depicted in the movie, if a suspect pleads not guilty, he will likely be detained, that is for 10 days. The first 10 days, and then which plus additional 10 days, so 20 days in total before going to trial. And then such a practice of detainment has been a little bit changing. However, pleading not guilty makes judges think, there should be some probable cause to suspect that he might affect the evidence or affect the victim of the case. So that's why it's likely that if he pleads not guilty, like he will likely be detained for 20 days is unusual, because 10 days is quite short for the prosecutor to complete the investigation. So 20 days usual. And then, so as you said, and also as in the movie, if it's the first offense to that suspect, I mean, he is the first time to be arrested by this offense, right? And also there are two kinds of offenses for groping, actually, which is also explained in the movie. One is like the violating the ordinance against disturbing the peace, which is a weird name, but it's not only for the groping. However, it's more like ordinance by the prefecture. So every prefecture has this kind of ordinance, and which is applied to groping as well. So, and they applied when the offense is more like touching outside of the underwear. If the criminal, put his hands into the underwear, the offense is more serious, which is called indecency through compulsion, which is much more serious crime. And then, so his offense is the lighter one, right? The violation of the ordinance. And then, so it's the first time for him. So it is likely that if he pleads guilty at this point, he would not be detained and charged with a fine, even if his case go to trial. So therefore, what the first lawyer, the Toban Bengoshi, said to him is true. Even though, such a suggestion is against legal ethics, right? You cannot suggest the suspect who is, saying that, oh, I'm innocent, and then suggest him to plead guilty. Obviously, like we are, lawyers are prohibited to do this. However, even the first lawyer consider about him, and he is not working. He is free time, right? He is looking for a job. But if he work at a company and then be absent from company without any reason, and then if the information that he is arrested reach to the company, it's kind of likely that the company fire him. Even though like now maybe not every case goes like this, however, so that's why the lawyer suggested him to just plead guilty and get released, and then he will be fine even though he claims that he is innocent. Then the last one is 99% of the conviction rate, which is also described, and that is true in Japan. It may sound very, very high, unbelievably high for those in America, or deal with America. However, it means that prosecutors in Japan do not indict the suspect unless they believe to have very concrete evidence to prove guilt at a trial. So their investigation is really, can I say, precise, and they should be sure to make the decision to indict the suspect. So which means the significant number of cases sent to prosecutor's office from police office do not go to trial. So even though the prosecutor feels like, oh, maybe like this is, that he did it, he or she did it. However, they decide not to, indict the case if they are 100% sure that, they can prove the case in the trial. So I don't know, like this kind of practice of prosecutor's office is good or bad because you cannot be easily indicted. It's not a bad thing. However, this 99.9% conviction rate, might feel gives some unconscious bias to judges, right? Judges also know this kind of practice. So, like once a criminal is sent to the court, it's very highly likely that, prosecutor's office already collect the concrete evidence.
It's really interesting how that plays out. Since the prosecution doesn't like to or won't bring cases that it doesn't think it can win to trial, right? It does seem to weed out cases before the indictment. On the other hand, as you say, if the prosecution is moving forward, it creates this, as you said, unconscious bias that, that person is guilty. And I think the movie does talk about how it creates sort of incentives on the prosecution not to lose. Like once they decided to indict a case, there seems to be there's a lot of pressure that the case should result in a conviction. I also think it's kind of interesting in the movie that because all the incentives are on the defendant to plead guilty, right, avoid the trial, pay the fine, the fact that he decides to continue fighting almost seems like to be the persuasive to like his lawyers that maybe he's actually innocent. It's very interesting the way the dynamics play out.
Yeah. And also we don't have plea bargain, right? Like in the US. So, it's like either of the way, the plead guilty or not guilty. And then there's no room for the bargaining, or like the one in America.
Right. So the prosecution also doesn't then necessarily overcharge to try to result in a bargain. They charge the offense that you're signed with. So there's also, the movie does show sort of another pressure point or pressure on the defendant, Kaneko, is he's subjected to continued interrogation while he's in custody. So these can last how long, up to how long? And also, even though it's not depicted as there's no physical violence or even threat of physical violence, there is a sense that there's a degree of coercion, psychological pressure involved.
Sure, of course, like, detention and also interrogation by police officer as well as prosecutor provides, only that fact, gives so much pressure on those, suspects, especially the suspect. It is the first time for him. It's not, can I say repeater rather than the first time. First time for the suspect to be detained. And then like so many movies, not only this, but also TV program shows that it's such a coercive, interrogation by police officer. And then it still exists in Japan, I think, but like it's not everywhere, as the movie or the TV program shows, I think. But I don't know the true reality of the interrogation of the detained suspect by police officers. I've never experienced. I did some criminal, the offense, but it's a long time ago. It's all, the pleading guilty case. So I've never encountered, the case with the suspect pleading not guilty. So yeah, still exists, but not all the cases are like this, I would say.
Another thing the film explores is the challenges of finding a lawyer, and in particular, a criminal defense lawyer who will take a case to trial. So Kaneko, the defendant's mother, and his best friend Tatsu search for a lawyer, right, once Kaneko pleads not guilty and is going to fight the case. And so they, again, they try to find someone who has criminal defense experience versus like a corporate or commercial lawyer, and someone who's committed to a zealous defense and not just pleading guilty. Is there a criminal defense bar in Japan, and how is it organized?
So let me explain like how to find the public defender as well as private lawyer when you're, arrested and detained, or even not detained. So the public defender, like the offering public defender is mandatory if the suspect or accused cannot afford it, and which is, provided under the Code of Criminal Procedure, and the cost is borne by the government. So, and then like, so who would become the public defender for some particular case? It's like each prefectural bar association, we do have, the bar association in each prefecture, in addition to Japanese bar association, the overall. And then like the bar association organizes a list of lawyers to serve as a public defenders and assign the cases to them based on the list. So if lawyers put their names on the list of the bar association and they are assigned to a specific date, or your date is, for example, like, 2025, February 20, and then like, the lawyer needs to be ready to visit the police office if they receive the call from the court. And then they serve as a public defender. So it's kind of very, can I say, random according to that list. And then in Japan, every lawyer has an obligation to do some public job once a year. And then one such job is to serve as a public defender. I mean, they put the name on the list. And so, therefore, there's many lawyers put their name on the list in order to, fulfill this obligation. And then to have a public defender is not difficult. I mean, it's very automatic for the suspect or accused. However, the quality of the lawyer and experience and zealousness is just by luck. Yeah, so it's really depending on the luck. And then also the finding a good private lawyer is not easy for those who have never, encountered legal problems like the one in Mother and his best friend in the movie, because asking a lawyer is still very unusual thing for ordinary citizens in Japan. So I don't say like corporate lawyer cannot, do a good defense. Because I heard about a story like when, like the junior lawyer just, get the license and started work and like 3 years, 4 years. But those young lawyers who work in the business law firm, they are still very, can I say, motivated and they are smart. So if they are assigned a public, defense case, they do some really good job. Of course, experience matters, especially for those cases where the suspect is pleading not guilty. However, even if the case for pleading guilty, like there are lots of work for the lawyers to do. And then so, in that case, maybe zealous, I mean, the motivation matters a lot.
Japan has a protection, a privilege of self-incrimination, but in the movie, the defendant testifies at trial. Does that happen often? Will the defendant often testify, or is there most defendants invoke their privilege and require the prosecution simply to prove meet their burden without having to testify?
So I don't see the data, so I cannot say like how much, like most often or something. I should ask my judge friends. However, like maybe like as far as I know, or in my impression, like, even in those cases pleading not guilty, the, defendant, the accused, do testify in the court. I think that one reason is like they might feel like if they do not testify, it might, of course, it shouldn't happen, but it might still affect the impression of the judges, presiding judge. And also they want to provide their own story. So like before going to trial, the defendant and the lawyer discuss a lot how to, respond to the judge's question or the question by prosecutor. So I think it's still important to provide his or her own story.
Yeah, I felt in this case, especially without a lot of other evidence. Another issue that comes up is over the prosecution's obligation to disclose evidence. There are records of the interrogations of the accused. There's a report of the reenactment of the crime scene that seemingly can't be located. What are the rules governing the prosecution's disclosure obligations in criminal trials in Japan?
So, we do have some disclosure provisions under the Code of Criminal Procedure. However, it's not mandatory for all kinds of cases, because those disclosure provisions, the prosecutor's evidence, apply for those cases which accompany pre-trial proceedings. The Code of Criminal Procedure introduced mandatory disclosure of the evidence by prosecutors. But also this kind of introduction of the provision comes into play together with the introduction of pre-trial proceedings. And then we did not have pre-trial proceedings before early 2000 because this pre-trial proceedings was introduced at the same time of introducing lay judge system. Because before that time, like only prosecutors and judges and also, defense lawyers are the players in the criminal court. So we do not need to arrange the case, organize the case before going to trial, even though they did to a certain extent. However, they are professionals. So, those cases with very complicated, issues and facts that those, people, the professions can still deal with that without organization. However, after the lay judge court, the lay judge system was introduced, of course, some cases need to be presented to ordinary citizens without any legal background. So therefore, like in order to make this system work smoothly, we need to have, some, pre-trial proceedings to organize the issues and evidence. So that's why the disclosure provision was introduced at the same time. So the disclosure provision in the criminal procedure code now is mandatory for those cases with lay judges. However, the disclosure of the prosecutor's evidence is voluntary for those cases without pre-trial proceedings. So that's why in this case, there is no pre-trial proceedings. By the way, the lay judge system is applicable only for those serious crimes. So it's mandatory. So it is not the right of the defendant, like the one in the US. It's more like, if the offense is like this, provided under the code, and then the lay judge code is just applied. So it's mandatory. So except for those, lay judge cases, of course, lawyers can, request the pre-trial proceedings, but whether to provide the pre-trial proceedings is in the discretion of the judge, so it's not necessary. And also, even without pre-trial proceedings, the lawyer still can request the disclosure of the evidence to the prosecutors, like the lawyer did in the movie. However, it's still very voluntary. So it's not really, not very sure whether prosecutor disclosed the evidence or not. And usually, like the defense lawyer can, of course, see the evidence the prosecutor decide to, use in the trial. However, if the prosecutor decides not to use some evidence to the trial, the lawyer do not have any, or the defendant have any right to have access to those evidence. So this is the problem.
And as you're saying, the way the lay jury being mandatory, and as you said, in contrast to the US where you can waive your right, most defendants don't, but it's only applicable in certain cases. And so although the movie takes place before the lay jury system was introduced, if the movie had been shot and made now, there wouldn't be a jury anyway because the offense does not rise to the level where you would have a lay jury.
Yeah, right. So the sexual crime, like rape, is of course like, the lay judge court, the cases with lay judge court. However, violation of the ordinance, this case never go to the lay judge court because of the lightness of the offense.
Another thing the movie talks about is the bail system, right? So in the movie, the defendant isn't released on bail until after the victim testifies at trial. And the bail then is set at quite a high amount. I think it's about $20,000 US dollars or something in that range, which is, it seems very high considering it's a nonviolent offense and there doesn't seem to be any flight risk. And the rationale that's given is they need to wait until after the victim testifies because of the fear that the defendant might try to intimidate the victim. So how common is the practice of denying bail pending trial, and is it changing at all?
I'm not very sure about the frequency of the practice. However, it does, exist that like, the bailment, release with bail is not granted until the victim testifies in the trial court. This, but like, I don't know like how often, maybe depending on the, offense, right? So yeah, but it's likely that in this kind of offense, it happens, I think. But however, like theoretically, the prosecutors are supposed to complete the investigation before trial starts. So, the necessity to keep the detention, avoid the risk of intimidating the victim might be lower. However, especially the case where the defendant pleads not guilty, like maybe the judge would suspect that, there might be some risk of intimidating the victim. So it might happen, I think. And then, like, as you pointed out, the church is in general is around 10,000 to 30,000. It is say like, okay, so around this kind of range. Of course, like this is totally discretion of the judges. So it might be higher or lower, but however, the defense lawyer might explain to their client that, oh, maybe this range. And then, so maybe like those, accused with this kind of offense, this amount is not low, actually high. However, they cannot avoid, being charged this amount. And then, so this kind of, the amount of the church prevents accused who apply for public defender. I mean, like it means like, they cannot afford the private lawyer. So, they do not usually challenge request for the release with bailment. And also, yeah, however, like, before it is said that, even the keep detention after the trial, this is very ordinary custom. However, it's changing. I think it is said to be changed.
In the middle of the trial, judge is replaced.
Yeah.
And the movie notes the previous judge, the first judge, had 2 acquittal verdicts overturned on appeal. And the new judge seems, well, very, as we would call in the USA, a kind of pro-prosecution judge. So how unusual is this practice? Because in the movie, it seems to be sort of a defining moment in the trial.
Yeah, right. And those, actors play very well, right? The older one, the second one looks very, what can I say? Yeah, give very bad impression about Judge, the movie illustrated in this way. So, but like we need to be cautious about like, oh, it has happened just because of the attitude toward the case, like the attitude of the young judge, the first judge toward the case. Because in Japan, like judges in general, I mean in Japan, the judges are moved from one court to another every few years. So we have this kind of rotation system. And then such a rotation system is, is default. I mean, it's set to prevent judges from having too close relationship with the citizens or police office in one area. So in order to keep the fair trial. Yeah, so, when you become judge and the prosecutors as well, like you need to, be ready to move around Japan, in your career, it is already determined from the beginning. And then this kind of, rotation and also relocation of judges occurs at a certain time, such as the beginning of fiscal year, the April, or before summer vacation, this kind of specific timing in a year. And then, so, I think the sudden replacement of a judge outside of this kind of, ordinary rotation system rarely happens. You mean like this is more systematic. And then, so this movie too, I think the young judge was replaced under such a rotation system, just not because, he was going to render, not guilty verdict to this case, so that's why we need to replace him to the other court. No, this is very unlikely, I think. Even though there is such motivation, they cannot do this such an obvious way. So they need to wait until the end of the fiscal year to move him to the other court, I think. So however, changes in judges actually affect the result of the trial, I think. So yeah, but as I say, like it will affect. However, it is unlikely that the change is made in order to affect the outcome of the case. I'm not very sure, but it is a very, what can I say, important political case. Could be. I don't know. It could be. But however, even though this high stake case, like in this movie, however, it doesn't happen to change the outcome of this kind of, minor crime, I would say.
As one of the defense lawyers notes in the movie, once a person's indicted, they need to be convicted. That's a public prosecutor's job, right? And then the movie also sort of suggests that judges won't get promoted in the bureaucracy if they acquit too many defendants. And we touched a little bit on this before, but how strong are the incentives and pressures in favor of conviction kind of within the system?
So, like I've never experienced as judge or prosecutor, so it's my observation, I mean, objective impression, from outside. But I think like there is a pressure on prosecutors as well as judges systematically, as you say, bureaucratic, career system. So as I said, because prosecutors usually indict only those cases with concrete evidence, right? They should be sure to prove the case in the trial. So the conviction rate is very high. And then so this practice in turn, I think, makes prosecutors have such a very high pride that they cannot admit that their failure, when their case turns out to be weak at a trial because of the defense lawyers, evidence, right? And then especially in those cases in which the accused plead not guilty, the prosecutors might feel like, oh, once we prosecute it, we need to win the case. It's kind of shame for them to lose the case because, it's like 0.01%, right? Yeah. But by the way, in Japanese prosecuting system, like the prosecutors who are in charge of investigation will not pursue the case in the trial. So they always change, the prosecutor who is in charge of, can I say, proving the case in the trial is always different from the one who investigated. However, like they move as a, system or organization. So anyway, like they cannot, give up the case, even though they, notice something wrong with the prosecution, I think. So that's why, like, because of this pride or like some, the idea. So the prosecutors are urged to appeal the case when the judgment is not guilty, I think. And also from the judge's perspective, it is said that, as you say, mid-promotion, right? So if the judgment is reversed by higher court too often, it affects the promotion of judges. I mean, I heard about this story by judges on so many, places, but I'm not very sure. But maybe because, probably, but I'm not very sure. Like, and also, like, in addition to the high conviction rate and the prosecutor's practice of appealing cases may affect judge's attitude, right? Or 99%. And if my, judgment is reversed in a higher court, and then if it happens too many times to me, like it might affect my promotion and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, like there might be some pressure on judges. Yeah, of course, if I ask judge, they would say no. However, maybe very unconscious, bias might affect them, I think.
I mean, you can see the logic of why, because if you're, these are judges, it's a bureaucratic system, they're not political appointees. And if the idea of appeals is correcting of error, and if you get reversed too many times, it looks like, you're making errors, right? There's some, logic to it in that sense, I think.
Yeah, I think, and the judge's promotion is all decided by Supreme Court. So there is some office, under Supreme Court to make all the decision about the career of each judge. Yeah, because their salary is already, I think, in accordance of the year. But like which court they are assigned or what kind of position they are assigned might also, be considered as their good career or not very good career, right? So if I would say, like, if you see the career of the Supreme Court judge, whose background of judge, he goes to very important court, not very remote area or something like that. So yeah, it is kind of promotion if they pursue this kind of good career. But not every judge is like that, I think.
In the movie, the defendant, Kaneko, is ultimately convicted. He's sentenced to serve 3 months, which I think the movie says he can do within 3 years, which I also found interesting. He also has to pay the cost of the trial, which is certainly different than in the US. But the main point is that there's no question based on the movie and what the movie tells you that he did not do it, right? It was someone else who did it. He's just the wrong person. So what was your impression of the verdict in the movie?
I think, like, as far as I consider all the facts or evidence presented in this movie, I think I would say there is a reasonable doubt for his committing a crime offense, because I think there's no objective evidence and also no direct witness in this case, right? And then the credibility of the victim is kind of key. However, as we saw in the movie, the credibility of victims' statement is a little weak, right? After the young judge asked, he made sure with her whether she followed the criminal hands with her eyes. And also, like, furthermore, the reproduction of the scene by Kaneko's team, the defendant team, supports his story. So I feel like, yeah, like I would say I hesitate to, if I were judging, I hesitate to, render the guilty judgment.
And actually, the one witness is a woman who is on the train, and as soon as it happens, she goes and she sees that Kaneko was taken to the station official's office to be questioned. She comes and says, or she tries to intervene and says it wasn't him. And then he tries to find her. She's left the station. And then there's a sort of a whole interesting part of the movie where his mother and his friend and eventually Kaneko himself, they show up, it seems like every day or many days at that station with like these sandwich board signs trying to find this woman again. And they ultimately do find her. And she does testify, even though her testimony wasn't overwhelmingly persuasive, in terms of what she saw. She's very clearly suggested that Kaneko was not the person. So I thought that was another piece of the kind of reasonable doubt in the movie.
Yeah, I agree with you. And also, like, another point about regarding evidence, because, the judge changed in the middle, right? And then the second judge didn't listen to the testimony of the victim by himself in a court, and then he just read a record. So it also affects him, like, if he sees the way the victim testified, maybe like it's a little bit not very sure, right? Regarding, whether she really followed her eyes on the hands. Yeah, so I feel like when they had, the testimony, the female, who said, oh, it's not him. I think like at that point, the second judge already have some, impression that he is guilty. He already made up his mind almost. So I feel like the judge asked several questions to her the testimony. And then, it sounds like, the judge was trying to find a reason to, rebut her testimony, the credibility of her testimony, right? Oh, how long is the time, when she saws the Kaneko, like trying to pull his jacket from the door, and also, the timing. The victim say, please don't do that, right? And it's 10 minutes or something. And then, like, at the verdict, the judge read out the reason, of the judgment. And he say, oh, he is like, oh, why he did not take this testimony supporting not guilty verdict. So I think like he already prepared, in his mind, this kind of judgment result. So yeah, I feel like, the timing was a little bit late, and also the change in the judges affect. I'm not very sure if the second judge precise in this case from the beginning, the result is the same or not. I'm not very sure about that point.
Yeah, it does seem like when he gives the reasons, and that's interesting, you judges have to give the reasons, right? Mm-hmm. That he was sort of looking to kind of find any possible holes in the defendant's story, anything that, any possible ways to undercut it, rather than kind of sort of saying, well, did the prosecution prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant had committed the crime? So one more question on the lay judge system. We know it was introduced after the movie, but it wouldn't have applied in the movie. What kind of impact has that had on convictions and sentences in the Japanese criminal justice system, the introduction of the lay judges?
I feel like I checked some data about, after the introduction of a lay judge. And then like the data shows that, for those serious crimes, the lay judge system is applied. They say like the sentence, especially the murder, the sentence has become, slightly higher than the case, before a lay judge court. It is kind of interesting to see this kind of data. And also the conviction rate is almost the same as those, having been judged by traditional courts. So it really does not change so much. And there is one interesting case, in Japan. So I think like in that case, it's like a child abuse case, I remember. And then the sentence rendered by lay judge court. The lay judge court is only for trial, right? And then so the sentence is kind of higher than usual. Than usual means like even for lay judge court and also traditional courts, like the criminal code have some range for the sentence, right? Of course, but it's very discretionary within the range. And then, however, of course, court has some data of the previous case, or if this is a murder case and there is some this kind of the conditions, and then the criminal kill, for example, like one person or two persons, three persons, and then maybe the range of the sentence is like this. So there is some average, average of the sentence. So they have some data, and then like it is revealed to the judge and the lay judge as well. And then, but anyway, so that one case, the offense was the child abuse, and the child was, murdered by his or her parents. And then the sentence, rendered by legislative court was higher than the average. And then the case was appealed to the higher court. And then, so the higher court rendered the sentence by the higher court was lighter than the, legislative court. And then feels like, this was broadcasted as well. And I feel like, we have the society have some, very, conscious about child abuse cases recently, right? And then they feel like, oh, we should, punish those parents more seriously. I mean, I would say like is better or not, but like, we have this kind of tendency in the society. And then like this kind of, awareness or the impression, I mean, the idea of the society was reflected in the lay judge, the court. However, it was, sentence was reversed by the higher court. So, what was the meaning of introducing lay judge system to reflect, public's idea about criminal justice? So it's either way, like victim side and also, the defense side. We do need to protect the human rights of the defendant. However, like we have this kind of, phenomenon in Japan.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see how it operates. I think like the overarching, or maybe the overarching, certainly an overarching purpose is to kind of deconstruct and critique the presumption of innocence, which is referred to often. It's sometimes given kind of lip service, it seems, as being sort of fundamental. And I think, that's true everywhere. Someone's systems that have a presumption of innocence, but often if someone's charged, the idea is, well, if they were charged, how can they be innocent? But anyway, this seems like the overall sort of point of the movie is to kind of critique that presumption. It's there, it's on paper, everyone acknowledges it, but in reality, it's not quite so strong. Do you agree with that, the message of the film and the critique?
Yeah, I think like it is true that the presumption of innocence, which is a fundamental principle of criminal justice, is not well working in Japan, given the prosecutor's practice of accusing cases with strong evidence, which results in 99.9% conviction rate. I agree. So, and also like as we discussed, like there should be certain pressure on the judge to render a not guilty judgment. So it's kind of, judges need to have some courage. I mean, need to be brave to render not guilty judgment, under all these kind of situation. And then, so in this sense, this movie is successful in making critique of this issue in Japanese criminal justice. However, at the same time, I feel like, I have an impression that in this story, in this movie, so all kinds of problems in Japanese criminal system occur, happens within one single case, which is not really usual, right? You put all the problems into one case. There should be one problem in one case, but another problem in another case, but like all the problems happens in one case. And then so which results in his, the outcome. So I think there should be several chances to prevent this case from being, turned into guilty sentence. And then I feel like first of all, as I said, it is kind of, not very usual, not 0%, but unusual that the prosecutor decides to indict him with the kind of evidence in this case. The evidence is not so strong from the beginning, I think. And then, so in the movie, one police officer stated to him when he was, released with bailment, like this case was unlikely to be indicted, right? So I didn't think that you're, indicted. So like, this is the impression of the the police at the time, and also impression of mine. And also that in order for the prosecutor to indict a case, bring the case to the court trial, I think like in addition to his decision, the decision of the prosecutor who is in charge of the investigation, such a decision should be approved by a prosecutor in a higher position. So there are some levels of the decision making in prosecutor's office. So like either of the prosecutors, like the one who was in charge of investigation of the prosecutor who make the final decision to go or not to go. So might raise doubt on the case in reality. But if the combination of the two is kind of go wrong, maybe like this case still be indicted. But like, hopefully like either of the two might work in reality. I hope, but I don't say like it never happened. I mean, this case never goes to trial in reality, but in reality, maybe like it cannot go so easily to the trial. And also, like the judge would render not guilty judgment given the evidence in this case. I think that especially the replacement of a judge, happened at a very bad timing in this movie, right? And the new judge didn't hear the victim's testimony by himself, and second judge's attitude toward the case really affected the outcome of this case. And also, outside of the point, however, in practice, I mean, the judge by themselves know like whether the replacement occurs or not. I already, in this court already like for 2 years, 3 years. So it's almost the time to be replaced to the other court. So they might know. And also they are notified like maybe at least 1 month or 2 months in advance, I think. And then so I see like I heard that, they still try to complete their case before the replacement occurs. And especially if if the judge is like the young judge who has some, the strong, can I say, belief in his mind not to make any miscarriage. I feel like he would try hard to complete the case before the replacement occurs at the end of the fiscal year. And also for the lawyer's side, the attorneys are very sensitive about who is the judge for his case, even in a civil court case, and especially for the criminal case. And the lawyer is very, experienced one for the criminal case. And he was judge before, right? And then, so I think it's very lucky for the defendant in this case that the case was assigned to the young judge. Because if the young judge has this kind of, tendency is already famous because the lawyers share this kind of information, or this judge have this kind of characteristics. So like if it's very lucky, so probably the attorney as well try to complete the case before the replacement happens. It's not really out of sudden. So that's why like, there should be some chance for them to finish the case. Yeah, because he pleads not guilty, so it makes the case longer. But, if I were the lawyer, maybe I would try my best to complete the case before the replacement occurs. So yeah, so leave it, not really the particular thing in this case, however, I would say. But anyway, so overall, like, I feel like what happened to the main role, the Teppei Kaneko, may still happen in reality. May happen. I cannot say like it never exists, it's just fiction. No, it may happen. However, I cannot deny it. However, not everywhere, not often. But, like, even if it's not often, like, even just one single case is the problem, right? So, as the younger judge stated in the movie, if the purpose of the criminal justice is not to convict even only one innocent person, this kind of purpose of criminal justice is not yet achieved under the current situation. But I would say, this happens everywhere and very often in Japan.
It's a great explanation. I mean, it seems like a lot of the critiques of the movie, the different critiques are, so they make points, but there's a sense where it's almost like a perfect storm. Like they all happen in one case, like everything possible, all the areas where things could break down or the incentives to push for conviction at the expense of having someone innocent convicted, all the different points where something can go wrong. And that in itself seems, a little unusual, while at the same time, the sort of different isolated points they make, or the different points there's something to them. So interestingly, the director, as I understand it, and the writer, Masayuki Suo, got the idea for the movie while reading something in the newspaper about a case of someone who's accused of chikan, of groping, and who was innocent. I think that in the case that he read about, it was reversed. The conviction was reversed on appeal. I think that's where the idea came from. Well, Naoko, are there any final thoughts you had on the movie?
No, I mean, like when I like talk with you, like, oh, which movie we can talk in your podcast, and then like you say, oh, like what about this movie? And I think, oh, that's great. However, like when I start to think about like to watch this movie again because it's already 20 years ago, it's kind of longer time ago. I was so surprised, and I feel like it's very difficult, to explain, especially to foreigners. I mean you and also the listeners who are mainly foreigners, and then like just like I try to be objective, about this movie. And also this is also related to the sexual crime, right? Which is still very, important issue recently in Japan and also America as well. So many, social programs just, merged into one movie. But it's kind of good movie. Yeah, I agree with you. And it's kind of very pleasure to talk about this with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like a good movie, but something to take with, as I say, kind of a grain of salt. Well, Naoko, it's been wonderful to have you on the
Yeah, thank
podcast and
you
to
so
talk about
much.
the movie. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.